In this episode, we talk about a small panchayat office that has been accused of producing thousands of forged documents linked to one of the biggest passport scams in India. We also talk about the plan to build medical colleges under a public-private partnership model that has set off a row in Andhra Pradesh. But we begin today by looking at the Supreme Court's latest order on the contentious Waqf Amendment Act. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Earlier this year in April, the President gave assent to the Waqf Amendment Bill, a law that sparked protests across several parts of the country. Now, under Muslim law, Waqf properties are those donated in the name of God for religious or charitable purposes. These properties are governed by state Waqf boards and cannot be sold or transferred. Now, the reason this law has drawn criticism is because it makes changes to how these properties are managed and regulated. For instance, it allows non-Muslims to become CEOs and board members of the Waqf boards and give district collectors wide-ranging powers over Waqf properties. On Monday, however, in response to nearly 65 petitions challenging the constitutional validity of the law, the Supreme Court placed a temporary hold on some of its provisions. So to understand what changes it made and the reason it did so, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's national legal editor, Apurva Vishwanath.
Apurva, what would you say has been the crux of the arguments against this law? Because ever since it was first tabled in the parliament, it has faced a lot of criticism from the opposition and those from the Muslim community.
So what the Waqf Amendment Act 2025 does is fundamentally change one key aspect, which is it deletes this concept of Waqf by user, which means even if there isn't a formal dedication of a place as a Waqf, but it's being used as a Waqf for a long period of time, say 50 years, 100 years, then it becomes a Waqf by use. So the law now does away with this provision and says that unless it is registered as a Waqf, it cannot be a Waqf. And in India, many of these things don't actually have registrations. In fact, the Indian Express has reported that a majority of Waqfs in India are not registered. As in, you don't know who actually dedicated the land because for about 100 years, it's been a mosque. So it's continued to be a mosque or, a graveyard. Many of these places are used as these communal spaces. So that was one key thing.
And so with this, was the fear that the majority of these Waqf properties will now be taken over by the state?
So the other thing the law does is that it gives the government a foot in the door to say whether a property is a Waqf or not. It does this by allowing the district collector wide powers, where the district collector, if he deems that a certain property is government property, then it ceases to be a Waqf property immediately. That is basically altering the character of that, title of that property as soon as the district collector, who's a government official, makes his determination. So it's essentially the government becomes a judge in its own case. So if the government says this is my land, then it's no longer Waqf land. So this power earlier was with the Waqf tribunal. So that's one big change which led to this fear that the government can usurp any Waqf land, or wherever there is, say, a dispute, that the government will come in and settle it. And when the government is settling a dispute, there is a fair chance that it might settle it in its own favor. So that was the issue. And I think there's also this question, like you mentioned earlier, about representation of non-Muslims in these Waqf councils and Central Waqf Board. So that was a big contention. Although these councils may not be performing religious functions, these are essentially attached to religion, right? So whether non-Muslims should be allowed in any of these places. So this was a contention. But I think over and above all of this, the big issue with the Waqf Act that was passed this year was whether voices from the community and even the opposition were heard at all. The bill was brought in and it was referred to a joint parliamentary committee, sure, which also had members of the opposition. But every amendment that the opposition sort of moved was negated. And all amendments that the BJP and its allies moved were accepted, right? So whether there was sufficient due process, and then of course it was passed because in the parliament, ultimately it comes down to numbers and the government does have numbers, so the bill was passed. So the big concern was, whether they were heard, and it did look like they were not heard. So which is why the Supreme Court proceedings became so important.
And talk about what are the provisions of this act that the Supreme Court has now stayed. What are the changes that it has made to it?
So, even before we get into what changes the Supreme Court has made, it is an extraordinary move for the Supreme Court to pause certain provisions here because, the court hasn't decided on the constitutionality of this law.
Yeah, this is an interim order.
Yes, and because legislations carry a presumption of constitutionality, because they were duly passed in Parliament, the government had numbers, the president gave assent, all of that happened. So courts are very, very slow or wary of staying such legislations. In fact, the only other instance I can think of in recent past is the farm laws, which was stayed by the Supreme Court. But that was also in a sense where the government would have also wanted the court to intervene so that, the protests could be stopped. So except for that, I can't think of another instance where a central legislation, a statute, something where the government put its weight behind in court, outside court, was put on hold by the Supreme Court. So in that sense, it's an extraordinary move. Of course, the court is very cautious while doing this because it is uncharted territory. So what the court does is it says, look, we're not staying the whole law because it is passed by Parliament and prima facie, these things have to be debated when the challenge is being heard. But as of now, that's not where we see the problem. But there are some provisions which are on its face seemingly arbitrary or violate some core constitutional principles. Those will be put on hold.
So not the constitutional validity of the entire law, but provisions which on the face of it seem arbitrary and against constitutional principles.
Yes, which are so obvious to anyone that, even before a final determination, we think, there might be a point where, because what this does is, till the court hears this issue, if everything's allowed to function as it is, it creates third-party obligations and changes the character of a waqf, for example. So it could eventually end up being an academic exercise like we've seen in so many instances in the past, right? Whether it's demonetization or electoral bonds. So to avoid that, the court says something we think is outrightly seemingly arbitrary, that we will pause. And here, what the court underlines is the separation of powers. Because like, I said earlier, the government becomes a judge in its own case, right? So the court says that a revenue officer cannot be making this determination. This has to be a quasi-judicial body, an independent, neutral body, which will determine whether something is waqf land or government land. So if the government plays judge, jury and executioner, it makes no sense. So that portion, essentially the court is tying the hands of the district collector and saying it's not the determination of the district collector, but till a jurisdictional high court approves it, the character of the waqf cannot be changed. So that is the big pause that comes in from the Supreme Court's interim order.
And Apurva, the other thing it has made changes to is the provision that talked about the inclusion of non-Muslims in waqf boards. And this is something that a lot of people had criticized that, how can you have non-Muslim members? So talk about what the court has said regarding that.
So, in fact, when the hearing was happening, this is one question that the bench constantly asked the government. Can you tell us or can you give us an example of any other religious trust where members of another community would be included? Say a temple trust or, something else. And the government did not have answers. So when it was pushed, the government did talk about public trusts, which like the Bombay Trust or things like this, but they were not of a religious character that way, right? So in fact, this is a concession that the government also made at that time saying, we will not appoint anybody new till XYZ this happens. So now what the court has done is put that in writing. It caps the number of non-Muslims in these councils to a certain number, which will ensure that they are not in majority. Because the fear was that if there are non-Muslims in majority in these boards and they essentially govern these waqf properties, right? So that could take away the religious character of these places. So that the court has said will not happen. And the other change that comes from the Supreme Court order is actually something that we'll have to see how it really plays out. The 2025 Waqf Act says that in order to make dedication to waqf, right? To basically who can create a waqf, that person must be practicing Islam for at least 5 years.
Which seems so hard to determine, right? Like, how would you find out if someone has been practicing Islam for 5 years?
Yeah, so that is a question that the court asks. But the government's intention is actually a lot deeper here. What the government says is anybody can be converted and their land can be dedicated to a waqf. So there is a lot of misuse. There are plenty of cases where non-Muslims have dedicated lands to waqf. I mean, these could be rulers in medieval times. So many people now also, in fact, we had a Sikh gentleman as one of the petitioners who said, why should I be stopped from making a dedication to waqf, right? So there is no bar that non-Muslims cannot make a dedication to waqf. So that was changed by the Waqf law. So now the court is saying frame rules on how you will determine this. How will you determine who is a practicing Muslim? And, how will you determine who's been practicing for 5 years or whatever? So till the states form such rules, this provision will be stayed. But that's, the states can form rules whenever and that will kick in. So that is still unresolved in that sense till a final hearing happens. But of course, all of this is till the Supreme Court makes a final decision on this issue. But this interim measure does send out a message that because there are such crucial rights at stake, we're talking about constitutionally guaranteed rights of minorities, the court will ensure that they are heard.
And in this interim order, the court didn't say anything about waqf by user, all those waqf properties that don't have proper papers, for example?
So there, in fact, the court refused to stay that provision, and it looks like prima facie the court is leaning in favor of the change that has been made. But again, these are very prima facie conclusions, right? For all you know, when the final hearing happens, the court can say that there is no need to cap non-Muslim representation in these boards. They can completely reverse their initial understanding of the law, right? So one of the things is, of course, they say that for a very long time now, statutes have had this requirement of registration, right? So if a statute has required you to register a waqf land and you still haven't done so, then the onus is on you and not the government to, regulate this. So in that sense, the court says this is prima facie okay. And the court also notes several arguments by the government saying that there's wide misuse. So, which is why waqf by user as a concept had to be removed. So, this is a question of legislative competence, right? Whether the parliament has power to do this. That determination will need the court to go to some length and look at these arguments in detail. So those are not questions that the court is looking at right now. Right now, I think the court was only concerned about this separation of powers, because if the government had the power to change any land's character, then that would essentially be game over. Right? So till the final determination happens, that's something that will be stayed.
And so where do things go from here?
So, I think now we'll wait for a final hearing. So whenever larger bench will be constituted for a hearing and that ruling has to come in. So, it could take a few months to a few years, anybody's guess. But till that determination happens, this will be the status quo.
And next, we shift our focus to a small coastal village in Bengal that has been linked with one of the biggest passport scams. In West Bengal's South 24 Parganas district, a small panchayat office in the Sundarbans has found itself at the center of a national scandal, accused of producing thousands of fake documents that may have been used to forge Indian passports. The Pathankhali Gram Panchayat, which has about 4,000 families, allegedly generated more than 3,500 forged birth certificates in just 2 years. What investigators are calling one of the biggest document fraud cases in recent memory.
Basically, it is in Sundarban Delta,
This is the Indian Express's Atri Mitra, who reported on the story for the newspaper.
Sundarban has hundreds of small islands like Pathankhali, and there are small rivers connecting this island with mainland of West Bengal. There are 15,000 of family residing there, and they had a GP called Pathankhali where the incident took place, and 8 villages are there which constitute basically this Gram Panchayat.
Now, this case first came to light during a Kolkata police probe into a larger passport racket. Officials believe that over 400 fraudulent passports were issued to individuals, many to suspected Bangladeshi citizens, using fake birth records from Pathankhali. So what was once a routine local office is now being accused of serving as a hub in an international racket. So, to understand how this investigation unfolded, we spoke to Atri, who began by explaining that this all started when the Kolkata police visited Pathankali village for a passport verification case.
Passport verification, there is a part of police verification also. So when police went to Pathankali GP, they saw the person who submitted his birth certificate from Pathankali Gram Panchayat, but he has no link with Pathankali. So suspicion increased at the end of the police officer, and he started investigation, and he saw within 1.5 year Pathankali village issued 3,500 birth certificate, and which is very unnatural. Then they started investigation, and you can say X is residing in Nadia district, which is 300 kilometers from Pathankali, but his birth certificate is from Pathankali GP. One person who residing in North Chobbish Pargona, which is 150 kilometers from Pathankali, and his birth certificate is from Pathankali GP. So that sort of information police got, and then they started investigation, and then they came to know that Gautam Sardar, one person who did this fraudulent practice in Pathankali GP, and he issued fraudulently at least more than 3,500 birth certificate within 1.5 year from Pathankali GP.
Right, and Atri, you mentioned Gautam Sardar, who is a key player in this racket. So, what do we know about him? And also, how did he manage to pull off something like this?
He is basically a common youth, educated youth. As far as villagers is concerned, we talked with the villagers, talked with the Gram Panchayat members, and also the chief of that village Panchayat. We came to know that he was a TMC worker, and he used to close to Panchayat from 2019. And then gradually he became very close to the Panchayat Pradhan Suchitra Bhuiya, and he got the login ID and password of this birth certificate portal, and he entered his mobile number instead of Panchayat Pradhan in that portal, and after office hour he used to issue such birth certificates from that portal using his mobile as the issuing mobile number, where he used to get the OTP, and giving that he able to issue such a huge number of birth certificates.
Right, and earlier you mentioned that Gautam is also connected with the TMC, right? So, what has been their response to all this?
Yeah, basically ground level TMC worker who are used to work every day in Pathankali, they are admitting, including the Panchayat Pradhan, we talked with her, Suchitra Bhuiya. She also admitted they did wrong, that they trusted Gautam Sardar, and Gautam Sardar took advantage of their trust. And he did such a huge volume of crime and continued for 1.5 years, and they have no clue about this crime. So they are admitting that. But top brush of Trinamool Congress, they are saying that they are basically not ready to quote it officially on this issue. But unofficially, they are saying that this is nothing related to TMC. Gautam Sardar is one person who is criminal. He did crime and he is now behind the bar. However, he bailed out last month. But they are saying that this is nothing related to TMC. TMC not encouraged such crime, basically.
And so, are the Gram Panchayats taking any steps to prevent such cases?
Yeah, exactly. Multiple rules now introduced to stop such fraudulent practice. They basically introduce that now nobody can use their mobile number to issue birth certificate. Only Panchayat Pradhan can log in. Panchayat Pradhan can issue that birth certificate. And after Panchayat Pradhan issue that birth certificate, finally BDO or such administrative person, if BDO is absent, then district magistrate will approve, which Panchayat Pradhan or local body's head already approved the application. So there are multiple checks and balance introduced in issuing birth certificate from Health Department of West Bengal to stop such fraudulent practice further.
And Atri, we understand that the police have said, and even you highlight this in your story, that Pathankali was just one link in a statewide passport racket. So talk about the scale of this racket, and also where does the investigation stand as of now?
Yeah, that is a one part. The basic thing is going on is the hundreds or thousands of Bangladeshis are coming here in West Bengal and they are accumulating fake birth certificate, Aadhaar card, voter cards, and using that fake documents, they are acquiring a genuine passport and going abroad to work over there as an Indian citizens. So that is very alarming for police administration and also Ministry of External Affairs. So that is the main thing. And already police unearthed, like Pathankhali, police unearthed one or two persons who used to make such fake voter cards, Aadhaar cards, and supplied to these Bangladeshis, helped basically getting genuine passport from the passport office. So police is considering that this is a huge racket and 9% already arrested by the police. And police is suspecting that more persons are involved in this manufacturing fake Aadhaar card, fake voter card also.
Right, and lastly, Atri, as you mentioned, that there are indications that, fake passports were enabling cross-border infiltration. So talk about how critical of an issue this is for the state.
Yeah, that is basically gradually become a serious issue for India as well as West Bengal, because West Bengal has huge bordering districts with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Bhutan. But after independence, crores of people came from Bangladesh and like Punjab and started residing in West Bengal and they became Indian. That infiltration basically continued even till date. Whenever Bangladesh is in crisis, the infiltration increased, like 1971 after Mukti Juddha, even 90s when turmoil started in Bangladesh. In this century also, 2010, 2011, 2012, and after 2012 in last 10 years also. And after the Rohingya issue came up, thousands of Rohingya also came over India. And investigating agency and intelligence agency also suspects that those who are now turning into terrorists or some of them are already became terrorists and coming to West Bengal with fake documents or porous area of the border and developing terrorist module in West Bengal, sleeper cells in West Bengal, and they are going to Kashmir, they are going to Syria. So that is a regular challenge for intelligence agency because they don't disturb West Bengal. They use West Bengal as a sleeper state and they are using such fake documents to have a legal passport. So that is very dangerous for the Indian security also. If terrorist organization used to get such legal passport with fake documents, so it is very difficult to identify them. So this is very challenge for administration, police and intelligence agencies.
And in the end, we turn our attention to Andhra Pradesh, where a government proposal to build medical colleges under a public-private partnership model has sparked a political controversy. Recently, Chief Minister N. Chandrababu Naidu announced that at least 10 government medical colleges would be developed through this approach, but insisted that the government would retain full control. According to a report by the Indian Express's Srinivas Janyal, Naidu clarified that private entities would only provide land and investment, while the state would oversee their functioning, fee structure, and admissions. He said that PPP model was meant to ensure efficiency, accountability, and financial sustainability without handing over institutions to private parties. He added that when government-run medical colleges face funding shortfalls, students and health services suffer, and PPPs were a way to address this gap. Health Minister Y. Satyakumar Yadav supported the plan, stating that outpatient services in PPP-run colleges would remain free, in line with existing government medical colleges, and that the NTR Vaidya Seva scheme, which offers free treatment to eligible beneficiaries, would also apply. Yadav said 4 new colleges would be ready by next year and argued that the previous YSR Congress Party government had failed to complete its proposed projects. But the YSR CP led by former Chief Minister Y.S. Jagan Mohan Reddy has of course strongly opposed this initiative. Party leaders accused Naidu's government of attempting to privatize medical education. Former Minister R.K. Roja highlighted that medical colleges in several districts were completed or near completion under the YSRCP government, but construction was halted after the new government took office. She argued that Jagan's plan to establish 17 government medical colleges was based on a Niti Aayog proposal to set up one college in every parliamentary constituency and was aimed at social responsibility, not politics. Another YSRCP leader, Kona Raghupati, said that 7 colleges had been fully constructed and 5 had already started classes under Jagan's tenure. He accused the current government of delaying projects for 15 months and now preparing to privatize them. Srinivas Janyal further reports that Satyakumar Yadav, while countering the criticism, had said that only 5 of the 17 colleges announced earlier became operational and that budget allocation were insufficient. Of the 8,500 crore rupees required, only around 1,400 crore was sanctioned. He stressed that PPP should not be confused with privatization, as the government would still regulate admissions and fees. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.